IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleagues Shambhavi Naik and Aditya Ramanathan. We're going to discuss a very interesting development that the working group to strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention, or the BWC, is taking place currently in Geneva. So the discussions are going to happen over a week or two, and the discussions are going to revolve around how to strengthen the BWC. So for our listeners, a brief background on what exactly is the BWC. So BWC is a multilateral treaty or convention which prohibits the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxin weapons. So this was the first multilateral disarmament treaty that actually banned the entire category of weapons of mass destruction. So for example, WMDs currently include chemical, biological, nuclear weapons broadly. So this was the first treaty that banned this class of weapons. These discussions started in late 1960s and it opened for signature in 1972 and entered into force in 1975, March to be precise. And this is one of the most participatory treaties in force. It has almost universal membership. And this treaty, has been successful more or less in the sense that countries have, all the signatories have declared that they have, they do not possess biological weapons. What is interesting actually, and why are we talking about this now, is that there have been discussions in the last few years, especially in the last decade or so, when the developments in the biotechnology field have rapidly advanced. And that has led to emergence of new technologies, which make it now much easier to create weapons using biological agents. And this has become much more stark, with the experience of the COVID pandemic. So as the experience of COVID says, obviously we don't exactly know, what the origin of COVID was, but it did kind of show how much of an havoc, both in terms of economy, in terms of human toll, can a biological agent kind of inflict. So currently the discussions are happening in Geneva. The working group is trying to understand and debate and kind of have a discussion on how the BWC can be strengthened. So my colleagues, Shambhavi and Aditya, both have worked extensively on trying to strengthen the BWC, and they wrote a paper on IPPR as well. So we'll discuss what those suggestions are. Me and Shambhavi also wrote a short brief for the T20 paper, so which we can discuss as well. So a very warm welcome, Shambhavi and Aditya.
Thank you, Saurabh. I think, Aditya, this is something that we have been thinking about for a while, and pre-COVID, right? The whole idea that the BWC needs strengthening. Do you think that the BWC, while it is looked at as a very successful treaty, do you think it was actually a good kind of starting point? It was obviously massive because up till then, I don't think we had gotten anybody to actually even destroy stockpiles before. To get all countries to agree to destroy their stockpiles, I think was a big move, but was it really implemented that well? Leading up to this century, how effective really has the BWC been? Do we even know?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Shambhavi. Thanks. I suppose one way we can measure its success is whether biological weapons have been used in anger. And it appears that since the treaty came into effect, they've maybe been used in one case in anger by a state. And even that seems to have been in suppressing its own citizens. Otherwise, it's just I'm talking about the white minority regime in Rhodesia in the 70s. And besides that, it's really been non-state actors. So that in that sense, it's been a success. The The Bioweapons Convention really came at this time of, when there were a whole host of multilateral or often just bilateral arms control agreements, starting with the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, all the way up to 1975 with the Biological Weapons Convention, the SALT I agreement on nuclear arms reduction, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So, I mean, this was the so-called period of, Cold War détente where the superpowers were trying to find arenas of cooperation. And it's also because they were quite scared about where things were headed, and they knew they needed to do some risk management. So we have to see the BWC in the context of that period, and obviously it has its limitations. One obvious limitation we know is that is the fundamental lack of verification, right? So the BWC does allow members to call to basically point fingers at another state and then call for an investigation. Unfortunately, that investigation has to be cleared by the Security Council. So if one of the cheaters is a member of the Security Council, they can just veto. And at least in the case of the Soviet Union, that seems to be the case. We don't know other members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, may have also violated the BWC, but certainly we know that the Soviets did, and they did so on a fairly large scale. They continued, so they had a fairly large bioweapons program even before 1972, where they tested aerosolized smallpox and so on. They tried many delivery systems, and they continued doing this after 1972, continued experimenting with multiple pathogens, smallpox, anthrax. In fact, in 1979, at one of the industrial cities in the Soviet Union, there was an accident where some anthrax leaked and about 60 people were killed, and it was covered up. So, in that sense, in terms of being able to verify, the BWC is not a success. And that's the problem that we're seeing today. The other issue is that, and this is common to all these agreements that came up in that time, is they're basically, technology is making them more and more dated, right? And because, I mean, you guys actually work in biology, so you know what you're talking about. I just know things like, I just know that CRISPR-Cas9 makes genetic engineering really easy. Okay, so that, while I don't know how that works, as someone who does track arms control, I have to think, well, as soon as that happens, we are going to need to at some point update these treaties. So I think just the fact that technology has changed, the fact that non-state actors, the fact that companies or even scientists, just as a lark, can, for example, synthesize a virus. I think all of these things mean that we are in a different world, and the way we approach, managing bioweapons and potentially hazardous pathogens, I think, has to change fundamentally. And I think that's the subject we've all been grappling with.
Yeah, I think by far it changes our definition of what is a pathogen. What can we actually use as a starting material to create a pathogen? And the moment we change that, it basically puts the science in everybody's hands to actually be able to create, if they wanted to. And it would take some skilling, it would take some equipment. It is not as easy as just, making it in your garage, which is true of some other applications of CRISPR-Cas9. But it is definitely bringing down barriers to creating bioweapons. And I think the other big change from a biological perspective is the fact that you can now tailor a bioweapon. The more we understand fundamentally about human biology, or about plants or animals, which are also can be potential targets for bioweapons, and the easier the tools get for us to manipulate biology, the idea that we could do, target individuals, or we can target ethnic groups, that I think is going to give it's going to make bioweapons far more attractive, because the selective use is something that probably conventional weapons do not allow. So that, I think, is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, so that's true. And I was just wondering, I think fundamentally when we think about biological weapons, they are fundamentally different from, let's say, nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, because the effect may not be very mass oriented. So for example, a very damaging bioweapon could be something that disrupts agricultural supply chain, right? So something in a war, in a situation where the supply chains are connected in a conflict. So imagine, even in the Russia-Ukraine conflict currently, imagine if the grain supplies or the farms of Russia or Ukraine were damaged so substantially by a bioweapon that they can't be used anymore. The havoc it will create both in the countries and in the global supply chain. So I think bioweapon would be more of a use of a strategic use, where you try to kind of reduce the ability of the adversary to to provide a effective response, than to, let's say, kill people, I mean, that can be done. But I'm saying this is a very kind of unique area where you also, the issue of, attribution also becomes very difficult. Where did this kind of agent come from? Even with chemical weapons, you have the OPCW, which has a mechanism, and you can still, find traces. Okay, this is something that is not natural. This is not found here. This chemical weapon was used, but the very nature of these weapons, biological weapons, make it much more difficult to provide attribution, and then the lack of a verification mechanism makes it like much more worse.
I think attribution is second stage. You might not be able to tell that something was a bioweapon. With climate change happening, and we can blame everything on climate change. We can blame heating on climate change. We can blame emergence of new diseases. And the similar is globalization, right? We don't know where we are encroaching. We don't know how much migration is happening and what new diseases are coming and what hosts and pests are coming in contact for the first time and what is jumping from where to where. So under those two gaps, we can actually very nicely explain away the emergence of a new disease, unless there's a very apparent scientific marker that you can trace, right? In the absence of that, I think COVID is a really good example of this, right? It's been so many years. We're still trying to figure out whether this was leaked, whether this moved naturally. If it moved naturally, where did it come from? If it leaked, where it came from? Was it a leak? Was it intentional? It is too late for us to actually probably to figure out the answer to that. And I think that is a very important aspect of BWC, because nowhere, despite all of the devastation caused by COVID-19, we could not really have a very comprehensive study of its origin because of the way multilateral political systems are arranged. We had to wait for Australia to kind of ping off the World Health Assembly to start an investigation. We had to wait for China to give its approval. And we basically started this investigation a year or more later than the origin. And by that time, it's very difficult to figure out where the origin might have come from, right? And not to raise speculation of how COVID came, right? But the problem here is that if we can't figure out where it came from, we can't fix it. We can't have public health measures that prevent something else from emerging again. So yeah, we remain bereft for that. And I think the current way the mechanism for BWC to be approved, like Aditya spoke about, is for someone to raise suspicion. And that comes with a huge political cost. So I think it's going to be very difficult for any country to actually do this. So that leaves us with a question. How do we then strengthen the BWC to be more preemptive, to take action if something does?
Yeah, you're right, Shambhavi. So I'm just wondering, what other kind of risks can we, kind of imagine that would BWC is facing or will face, and that is something that the treaty and the states parties should address.
Yeah, thanks, Saurabh. Yeah, obviously some threats remain the same, and there are new threats because of the new technologies. We typically think, when we think of bioweapons now, we are mostly thinking about non-state actors. And so typically, people think of Om Shir Nikio, which experimented with bioweapons. It didn't quite work out, but, then they ended up using sarin gas in the Tokyo subway. There's also the Rajneeshi group in the US, which did try and poison food somewhere with salmonella. It didn't kill anyone, but yes, it does qualify.
Did not try. They did.
Sorry, yeah, they did poison the food. People got sick. Nobody died.
They poisoned a salad bar with salmonella.
There you go. So there are cases like that. But we haven't had so far, and we've also there have been attempts at trying to develop bioweapons. There have been attempts by non-state actors trying to develop bioweapons. There was a terrorist group in 2019 in Indonesia that tried to use rosary pea seeds, which is you can make a lethal biotoxin out of it. There was a Tunisian man who was trying to again use some sort of biotoxin in Cologne, Germany in 2018. So there are these sort of lone wolf or small group type of attempts, some successful, some not, at trying to use or develop bioweapons. this is likely to get, so I think we've been lucky so far. This is likely to get more dangerous simply because these things become more accessible. So, we do have to wonder what type of groups might use these weapons. So I think we can try and disaggregate some of these non-state actors. So on the one hand, you have, for example, separatist organizations that have a national agenda, that want to create a separate state and so on. Typically, what we've found is that these type of organizations have put limits or constraints on their own use of violence. For example, some of them may restrain the use of violence deliberately on civilians simply because they need to be seen to be pursuing a legitimate cause, and they want to gain acceptance, internationally at a time when they are, successful. Or even when they're pursuing negotiation. So, we've seen this, by the way, even with non-separatist organizations like the Taliban, right? So they've all tried to put the best face on their behavior at a time when they're pursuing negotiations. How they behave afterwards is a different matter. So those kind of states or non-state actors are unlikely to use bioweapons. At least they're a lower risk. But then, of course, you have all these other, sometimes you have just crazy cases like Shambhavi, which, is just still just amazes me. And you can always have these sort of apocalyptic organizations that don't really care about attribution, and because they often have multiple splinter cells, sleeper cells, the group is decentralized in its structure. They're not so worried about attribution, because even if you go and knock out a few cells, other cells can continue to operate and so on. And then, of course, there are groups that both are, have that sort of, that are unrestrained, like Shambhavi, and also have at some point controlled territory. And ISIS is a perfect example of that. Could probably throw in Khmer Rouge as well. And so those are the type of non-state actors. Of course, Khmer Rouge took over a state, sort of like the Taliban. But those are the sort of non-state actors that could potentially in the future use bioweapons. And these may not be so, these sort of organizations may not be so worried about attribution. In fact, they might welcome it. They might say, hey, we're responsible, because, they might often have apocalyptic ideologies. They might want to, they might see the bioweapon attack as a sign of them, coming closer to their goals, whatever those might be. On the other hand, with states, it's different. We've talked about the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972. What was amazing about it was that it actually asked, it basically said, remove this whole class of weapons, which is fairly uncommon in arms control. But even the BWC really is, part of it is just reaffirming the 1925 Geneva Protocol, okay, which basically said don't use bioweapons in war. Now, so we have a norm of about 98 years now as of this recording. It's soon going to be a century. And very few states have in this last 100 years actually used bioweapons in an attributable fashion. You have a few examples. I mentioned Rhodesia. Imperial Japan used bioweapons in China in the 30s and 40s, but these are fairly isolated cases. You don't really have large-scale use of bioweapons by one state against another. Now, some of this is definitely about military efficacy and so on. Bioweapons are not necessarily great tactical weapons, so in the sense that you can't use them to gain necessarily battlefield advantage, but you can use them on a strategic level to sort of weaken an enemy. Now, to weaken an enemy, the bioweapon has to be effective enough to do that, right? And here, if you're a potential attacker, you are balancing the trade-offs between, for example, lethality and infectiousness, right? So if a bioweapon kills off people immediately, it may not spread as fast. But on the other hand, if it spreads fast, if a bioweapon is less lethal, it can actually potentially spread fast. So it really depends on what, as a potential attacker you're trying to achieve. Then bioweapons don't necessarily need to target people. Bioweapons can be used against crops, livestock, and so on, right? And so you could use them to sort of create economic disruption, social disruption in an adversary. And this can happen even, during peacetime, all of these sort of things. The challenge here is that you do not want attribution. And the question is that possible, right? So again, if you look at studies of how investigations are done into, for example, state-backed terrorism, you find that as long as, it's a high casualty event and you have a fairly robust state, you have that combination of those two things. Typically, attribution is done. Attribution is successful in those attacks, right? So you're able to identify the state responsible. You can also, make probabilistic assessments, right? All of these are probabilistic. Okay, things that haven't been going well with that state, so they're probably the ones responsible for it, right? So you are likely to make that attribution. So, if you're the attacking state, do you really want to risk that? Because you have a norm that's now 98 years old. All of these countries are party to it. By the way, India is a party to the 1925 Geneva Protocol because it's, it inherited it from the British Empire. So do you really want to be the country that's breaking that norm? If you want to be the country that's breaking that norm, the risks, the rewards have to outweigh the risks. And unless that happens, I think it's fairly unlikely that states will use bioweapons in attributable fashion. Now, they could use it in other sorts of non-attributable fashion, against non-state actors, right? So you could use them against rebels, or you could use them, say, perhaps in some chaotic battlefield in Ukraine, right, by either side. A few years back, in the last decade, we saw these drawn-out sieges, for example, in the Syrian civil war. These are, to my mind, a sort of ideal situations, ideal in quotes, where a state actor could potentially use bioweapons in a siege to, for example, weaken an adversary. And this is a really old thing, right? It goes back to ancient times. We know about the use of, for example, dead animals and so on, basically trying to use them to spread infections inside a besieged city. And there's no reason for that, why that is not possible today in those sort of situations like a civil war, where it's not so easy to investigate and verify, where the people being besieged themselves may have limited means of trying to investigate, do contact tracing, figure out and attribute whether for example the pathogen has been artificially or deliberately introduced or is natural. So I think those are the sort of situations where the risks exist, and I think those are by themselves enough for us to rethink the BWC.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
That's very interesting, right? So, I think so. So, Shambhavi, given that as advancements in biotechnology and gene engineering, all of them, they grow by leaps and bounds. And obviously, I think regulations usually don't catch up with the technology. It's usually regulations are like they play catch up to new tech. So what kind of reforms can the BWC take, at least in order to monitor these threats in a more efficient way, to at least alert the states parties and people in general that how these technologies, may be used so that the countries can make laws to address these gaps?
Right. Now that both of you have given excellent ideas on how bioweapons can be used across the world, let me speak about how we can prevent the use of bioweapons. I think so. The BWC, I think there are three things that really need to be done. First is funding for BWC. BWC is extremely poorly funded. They were supposed to have an experts review meeting a few years ago to study how gene editing, etc., will impact bioweapon development. And what ended up happening at that expert meeting was they took up the entire time to discuss how they would fund the next round because there was actually no money. It is supported by a 3-person implementation support unit, which means that implementing the BWC's provisions is also not as simple as some of the other conventions. And so I think funding is something that really needs to change. And it is strange that despite COVID, a greater emphasis on biosecurity has not come. So that's the first thing. The second, I think, is to equip the BWC to actually keep a pace with technology, right? And for this, a number of us have proposed this idea of having a scientific advisory board. And even at earlier this year at the BWC's meeting, there was quite a few NGOs who put that forward. And I think that is going to be on one of the agendas for the working group meeting as well, on how to create the scientific advisory board and how, what its functions will be. I think 2 developments that have happened in parallel, which can create optimism, is one, the pandemic treaty, which is under negotiation, is due to be signed next year. The pandemic treaty within itself is supposed to also have a scientific advisory board to help create provisions to help with understanding of how pandemic spread and how they emerge. And yesterday, the UN Secretary General announced the formation of another scientific advisory board to basically balance out the good and bad. And I think this is going to be very important. We can't think about applications such as gene editing only for the bad. It is not only for the creation of bioweapons, you're also creating diagnostics and therapeutics, etc., which is going to be critical. So when we come to assessing or recommending policies to kind of regulate these technologies, there has to be a balance for which scientists need to be involved in the actual creation of these policies. And therefore, I think this is really good that both the pandemic treaty and the UN Secretary General feels the necessity to create a scientific advisory board. And therefore, I hope that the BWC also takes it on its own will to create one for themselves. The scientific advisory board, I think, can do a couple of things. They can look at technologies which are coming up and how they can potentially be used for the creation of a bioweapon and help to kind of regulate their spread. They can look at pathogens themselves, how they are evolving, because we can't really know whether the evolution of a pathogen is natural or it has been intentionally made. So just giving a database of, say, whatever, I mean, I don't think we even know how many pathogens exist right now and have the potential to jump to humans. So creating and maintaining a database of that is going to be wholly important for preparation for future pandemics. And the third thing is that there has to be a recognition that the origin of outbreak at the time it happens is not the most critical part. The most critical part is early detection and response and stopping its spread. And therefore, the response to the spread of technologies that can help bioweapon development has to be the spread of technologies that can protect human and agricultural life. And I think that 2 or 3 excellent things which are happening on this front. One is this One Health approach that the WHO is espousing, which looks at animals, humans, plants, and the environment in toto. And therefore, then you start looking at surveillance of diseases in complete homogeneity. You're looking at all of the spheres from where diseases might come. And the second is the idea of this pandemic treaty, which also talks about things like antimicrobial resistance building, etc., climate change and the impact of that. So there are global treaties that are now being put into place to ensure that we are looking at disease surveillance and early detection as a priority, I think, which is excellent. What we, from the Indian perspective, need to do is invest more in healthcare and our own domestic surveillance capabilities, because the only real answer to someone kind of trying to use a bioweapon against us has to be early detection and early response. We saw this work really well with Nipah, for example. So it wasn't a bioweapon, it's a very naturally occurring pathogen, but we could stop it very early. And that is really the capability that we need to build. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, any increase in state capacity, the capacity of a state to do contact tracing, to treat victims, to be able to control the spread of a disease is by itself the best deterrent against the use of bioweapons. And it's something that has, dual use. It's for both, against bioweapons as well as naturally occurring pathogens. So I think it's something that is a no-brainer that states should invest in. I'll just add one more point of optimism, which is that, in 2019, when I joined Shambhavi on this project, it was hard to get anybody interested in the subject of bioweapons. And then the pandemic happened. And then everybody was very interested. I think we should still, the pandemic is not a bioweapon, but we should use this opportunity because typically, these sort of arms talks have been most successful when there is real concern, palpable concern about a situation and there's an attempt at mitigating risk. This is actually a good time for us to really get started talking on bioweapons, and we should use it. Finally, one point, Shambhavi had said, like CRISPR and all of these things, gene editing tools are absolutely major sources of economic productivity, right? So essentially, these are dual use tools. So it's very difficult to prescribe the tool itself when it is dual use. But in my personal opinion, this is not necessarily the view of the Indian state and Indian diplomats, but my personal opinion is if you can't control the things, you control behavior, right? And the way to control behavior is to have norms, rules, practices, and regulations. And I think we're also at a state where the companies themselves in the private sector are more open to this today. So I think for those two reasons, there is some room for optimism and some potential for change.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think the COVID pandemic, at least, I think, highlighted to the world, especially the common people and even policymakers, that biological weapons, or at least threat from misuse of biological technologies, can be a huge risk. Scientists were speaking about this for a while, but nothing shakes up the system like a crisis. We do see some sort of movement towards trying to address it. So as we discussed, there's a treaty at WHO, there's the discussions by BWC. Even states are taking steps to address these gaps or lacunae at their own level as well. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see, how exactly the BWC is reformed, if at all. I mean, it certainly needs reform. There is no doubt about that. But whether, again, will we repeat the kind of pessimism of COVID where it was such a big deal, but there was no global agreement on, proper research and investigation into origins because it became too political. So hopefully, I think it will be worth tracking how these discussions, especially at the BWC working group, pan out, and how exactly the private sector and academia and scientists, all of them, I think, take part in making this structure more resilient. So that's the time we have. Thanks a lot, Shambhavi and Aditya, and I look forward to talking with you guys again when we have a draft proposal for the amendment to the BWC, which makes it more strong. I am not holding my breath, but at least hopefully something more concrete.
Thanks, Saurabh.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.